Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapy's blog Author Spotlight series. I'm Dr. Katie Mineta, and I'm so glad to be here. Each month, we feature one of our diplomates or fellows who's written a blog article for the Academy. We share ideas, research, and offer examples of what high-quality CBT looks like in practice. This is a chance to highlight the creative and thoughtful work happening across our community and to get to know the people behind it. Today, I am joined by Larry Cohen, LICSW, A-CBT Fellow, and one of the nation's leading experts in the treatment of social anxiety. Larry is a highly respected CBT practitioner, trainer, and he's also the co-founder of the National Social Anxiety Center, a network of regional centers dedicated to providing evidence-based care. Larry has written a powerful piece for our blog titled Shame, the Oft-Neglected Target in CBT for Social Anxiety. In it, Larry explores how shame is often at the core of social anxiety and how addressing it can transform our treatment outcomes. Larry, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So happy to have you here. So I'm going to be asking you some questions today, some about the wonderful article that you've written, and some about the other work that you do for our wonderful community. So let's start. So Larry, you describe shame as the oft neglected target in CBT for social anxiety. I just love that phrase. Could you tell us what made you realize that shame and not just fear sits at the heart of social anxiety disorder?
Well, I realized it in the very beginning of my social anxiety work. I come from a background, I'm a clinical social worker, but before I entered psychotherapy work, I was doing community organizing and I was leading support groups of all sorts of different types, in particular in the LGBT community. And so when I first started social anxiety work, I was leading groups. This is back in the starting 1990. I was leading social anxiety CBT groups very specifically for the LGBT community. And these were at the time youngish baby boomers and also people of the World War II generation. And so for them, their fear of judgment, social anxiety, was very obviously shame-based. It was based on a sense that they are judged, actually often the correct sense, the accurate sense in any event, that they're being judged for who they are. And so it was clear that it wasn't enough to do exposure work so that they can watch and notice that their anxiety goes down if they let go of their safety behaviors. That is certainly crucial, but it was also important to examine their underlying shame-ridden core beliefs and using the exposure work as behavioral experiments to target those core beliefs also.
Very interesting. I didn't know that about you and your group work early on. So I'm curious, why do you think it's been overlooked? Why do you think shame has been overlooked in so much of the traditional CBT literature?
With regard to social anxiety, I mean, I do think shame is addressed in other regards. I mean, here I'm hypothesizing. I don't know for sure, but social anxiety has always been known, and actually in the ICD still is, as social phobia. And it's been treated as a phobia. And specific phobias are not shame-based. They're not based on the belief there's something wrong with us. They're based on the belief, an exaggerated belief in the danger or risk, or in other cases, the disgustingness of some other thing, object, situation, animal. And maybe people with phobias are sometimes embarrassed to talk to other people about it, but they're not phobic because they think there's something wrong with them.
Right.
And so by treating social anxiety disorder or social phobia as simply a phobia, and clearly is, it meets the criteria of a phobia, but treating it as simply a phobia there's no shame element. It's all about the exaggerated fear of judgment, of embarrassment. And that's certainly part of it. But the reason for the exaggerated fear of judgment and embarrassment is almost always, in my experience over 35 years, is almost always because of the concern that either they already believe there's something fundamentally wrong with them, or in some cases, it's a conditional belief. In many cases, it's a conditional belief that if someone were to judge me, that means there's something wrong with me. But either way, that's shame-based.
Right, absolutely. It's so interesting. It's sort of ringing in my ears that and I know this from your work that there's so much about these underlying assumptions that drive those shame-based feel thoughts and feelings that we have about
That's right.
ourselves. Yeah,
That's right.
that's wonderful. Really interesting. And it really is interesting we really can distinguish it from the other simple phobias, right, in this very unique way. And the treatment has to adapt. So you've said that exposure therapy, and we know this, right? Exposure therapy is the gold standard for social anxiety, but you emphasize that traditional exposure doesn't really touch shame. So, how do we modify exposures so that they become the experiments you talk about that actually challenge those deeper shame-based beliefs?
So here I want to credit the work of David Clark at the Oxford Center for the Treatment of Anxiety. I don't have the name exactly right, but at Oxford University. He talks about the importance of conducting our exposures as behavioral experiments in order to test and gather evidence to evaluate our belief in the anxious thoughts that are causing trouble in the first place. Now, that's in traditional exposure therapy, but the good news is traditional exposure therapy is actually for quite a while now, moved into the second wave, through the work of Michelle Krasky and others. But in very traditional exposure therapy, it wasn't about beliefs or even cognition at all, at least not explicitly. It was about habituation. Go into a triggering situation. In the case of social phobia, it might be a party or a work meeting or a public bathroom. Even go into a triggering situation, and without using safety behaviors that normally they would have used, stay there until their anxiety is down 50% or whatever, and keep doing those exposures until eventually they habituate. Well, it turns out that habituation doesn't happen so readily with social anxiety. Now, part of that is because of the heavy reliance on safety-seeking behaviors. But even if you encourage, which is absolutely essential, a client to lessen safety-seeking behaviors, a lot of what they're afraid of is invisible. If you think about it, social anxiety is the exaggerated fear of judgment. Well, some people voice their judgment, especially if you're an adolescent or a child, you get a lot of judgments out loud. But in adulthood, unless you're president of the United States or something, in adulthood, judgments tend to be kept to ourselves or voiced to third parties. There are exceptions, but in general. And so a socially anxious person doing exposures will often walk away and think, well, they were just being nice. But who knows what they're saying to their friend? Who knows what they're at least thinking about me? And so exposure alone, although it's useful, in fact, it's essential, isn't enough. It's important to conduct them as behavioral experiments to test not only predictions of what will happen in the situation, but also to test the underlying core beliefs and conditional beliefs we have about ourselves.
Right. It's so interesting as you're saying all of this. I'm thinking back to a training I did with Christine Podesky so long ago, and she said that one of the reasons why sometimes social anxiety, traditional just support groups don't necessarily help that much is because everybody's so nice, right? And so people walk away going, well, nobody's going to think these terrible things about me because they're all suffering too, right? And so
Sure.
it's a hard place to do exposure in a way that's meaningful, right?
in the
Yeah.
group itself, but having led, I led 100 groups. I stopped at 100 because thought I,
Wow.
I thought I didn't have any more in me. But anyways, having led 100 groups up until last year, it is true. Well, although early on they're very anxious about being judged by each other, but sooner or later they learn that people are so nice.
Right.
And then we go out.
That's
Then we go
right.
out into the field and talk to strangers. And yeah,
Exactly.
they go out in pairs, so they have each other's support and as well as observational data that we then discuss later. But they go out in pair and interact with strangers and so forth.
Right. Which is such an essential component, right, of any good social anxiety treatment group.
Right, right.
So, you've coined that you said there that you call them, you prefer the term behavioral experiments over simple exposure. Could you share a favorite example, maybe one that's been especially powerful in helping a client challenge a shame-based belief?
I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I have so many examples. These are just so delightful. So I'll start with a couple and just interrupt me because I could just go on forever with examples. So first of all, I want to say early on an explicit level, the behavioral experiments we're doing are testing specific predictions in which trigger their anxiety. For example, if I make a mistake in a conversation, people will cringe or roll their eyes or turn away and end the conversation abruptly. But even in those experiments, so that's not explicitly dealing with shame explicitly, but even in those experiments, we discuss what are the underlying beliefs about yourself if that were to happen. And it's very easy for a client to say, it depends on the client. But for example, it might be if I'm not perfect in the way I interact with others, people will think there's something wrong with me. Well, that's a shame-based belief.
Right.
And we can do the same experiment, talking to strangers at a meetup or some other social event, and identify not only what the evidence is that you gathered that challenges the explicit prediction of what would happen in the moment, but also what does that evidence say about your underlying core beliefs? So, for example, in my group, we go out in pairs and do in vivo exposures, which we call field trips.
Mm-hmm.
And we went one day to the National Mall. I'm in DC. And so there were free museums. And when there's an odd number of group members, I'm paired with somebody. And I was paired with this young man who we agreed would call me his uncle. And he would go up to young women in a museum atrium area where there are tons of people walking by. And he'd go up to young women and start talking about a huge exhibit next to him and make conversation. And so that was a straightforward experiment, just about making conversations with strangers. But then he would do an experiment to test rejection and what rejection means. So then he would then ask them out after talking to a stranger for like 3 minutes. Well, I mean, people in DC just don't do that. And so, but he did. And he did it understanding he would almost certainly get rejected, and he indeed did. But what was so interesting, and actually I found a little surprising in a positive way myself, is that as he did this with probably a dozen different women over the course of an hour or so I was with him, is that in several cases, the person continued talking to him. She would say, "Oh, no, 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 I'm not interested. Oh, thank you. That's really thoughtful." Or no one said anything mean. Some people looked surprised, but I mean, he was being so nice. No one said anything mean. But in quite a number of cases, people continued talking to him. And when we would talk about it afterwards, he learned that, okay, he was rejected by everybody because he set up a situation in which that's
That
almost
would be
guaranteed.
likely, right? Yep.
But he learned that rejection doesn't mean there's something wrong with him, because if it did, why would they stay talking to him? And even the ones that didn't stay talking to him, they reacted positively and they clearly enjoyed talking to him. And
Right.
so that was an example of a straightforward experiment, but it challenged his personalization about rejection. And I want to squeeze in one more.
Do it.
A lot of people with social anxiety are afraid of their anxiety showing. And
Hmm.
so I was paired with this young woman who has very fair skin and who blushes easily. And we were at a farmer's market, an outdoor market on a nice day. And so we had planned that she would go around saying that this is a great experiment, by the way. I recommend that she's a psychology student. It wasn't true, but nonetheless, that she's a psychology student. And would you mind walking up to people? Would you mind answering a couple questions? So she did survey as an experiment, and we
Hmm.
had designed the questions in advance. And she's asked, um, what do you think when you see somebody blush when you're interacting with them? What do you think about them? And then the other question is, and do you ever do that? And of course, the other part of the experiment is in the course of doing it, she inevitably blushed herself because it was kind of an embarrassing thing for her to
Right.
do. Well, it was a delightful experience. She walked up to a bunch of people. Usually they were groups of people, small groups. And she got nothing. I mean, we got all these very interesting conversations started. Nobody said anything negative. Some people did say, I would think that the person was feeling embarrassed or anxious. Other people
Right.
thought, oh, I just think they're fair skinned or they're hot or whatever. There's a whole range of theories, but nobody said anything negative. And then a number of people, it kind of made me feel bad. A number of people we were interacting with started blushing themselves because they also blushed. And then they would acknowledge, oh, yeah, I do it too. It's a little uncomfortable, but then she would start talking to them, and then we talked about this. And again, on the surface, the experiment was just to gather information to test her beliefs, but it helped her feel less shame to realize, okay, blushing, first of all, people may or may not notice it, but even if they notice it, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you.
Right.
It's just something your face is doing.
Yeah.
So that challenged her sense of shame as well.
Those are both wonderful examples, Larry. And it's so interesting. I want everybody to just notice for a minute, right? We have the behavioral intervention and the cognitive piece of this intervention and how beautifully sort of interwoven those are in those examples that you gave. Love it.
Yes.
It's
And if you
wonderful.
don't mind, I want to squeeze in one more,
Do it.
which is one of my personal favorites just because it was so entertaining. But in a group, I had a gay male member a good number of years ago who had core beliefs that he was too effeminate to be attracted to the men that he wanted to be attractive to.
Mhm.
And so that he would never, and so it induced shame, but also depression and hopelessness that he would never find a relationship. Actually, by the end of the group, he started dating, but no, before that, um, and he would, some of his safety behaviors is that he would wear loose fitting clothing that would hide his body.
Mm.
He would sit on his hands because he was afraid his hands would do things that he interpreted as feminine and stuff like that. Well, it turns out he's a talented dancer. I didn't know this, but he also was afraid that that would be viewed as an effeminate thing. So his exposure, his behavioral experiment in session was we played on my computer It's Raining Men, which is this sort of um, gay iconic disco song from
Yes,
the
it
early
is.
80s. It's really a funny song. And he stood up in front of this group of otherwise entirely straight people and lip synced and danced. Oh, and he was wearing tight fitting clothing for the first time. So he
Awesome.
was appearing fully himself, showing his body through his clothing, but showing his body and behaving in ways that he had viewed as, well, as feminine. In fact, he was lip
Right.
syncing to a female singer. So, I mean, it was appearing as feminine. And what was so amazing, first of all, it was very entertaining. He was very good. But what was so amazing in terms of a learning experience is afterwards, when he asked for people's feedback, and I explicitly asked them to just ask an open-ended questions, not do I appear like a woman, but more
Mhm.
open-endedly, like how did I appear to you and things like that. People said things like, you're a really good dancer. How did you learn to dance? They would talk about his talent. And then he would ask questions to try to dig out, do you think I appear feminine? Like,
Right.
well, how did I appear physically? And I said, you appeared rather handsome. You appeared rather attractive. All sorts of things going on. No one said anything about him appearing like he wasn't masculine enough. And
Right.
he said that was such a learning experience. He had felt such shame about feeling like he wasn't a man enough, that he was hiding himself and avoiding interacting with
Wow.
people. And here he was in an exaggerated way appearing feminine, and no one cared about that. They just liked his dancing and that he was attractive.
Right. What a wonderful example, and what a powerful moment to experience with a client too. I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It was also fun. Some of these
Yeah.
experiments were very fun.
They're fun. I know this is, and I too, me, I'm an exposure therapist too. I do ERP and exposure work, and I find it to be really some of the most enjoyable work that I do in my clinical practice. I think it's so fun. So I
Yeah.
want to turn our attention just for a minute. So Larry, this is Larry's book. It is such an incredible book. In my opinion, this is kind of a one-stop shop for both clients and for clinicians too, who want to really understand how to treat social anxiety.
I,
I think it's absolutely terrific. One of the things I love so much about the book, but one of the things that I really admire in your workbook is how you bring together all three waves of CBT. And we talk about this, right? The three waves of CBT, we talk about it a lot: the behavioral, the cognitive, the mindfulness-based traditions. Can you walk us through how combining those elements creates a more complete approach to social anxiety?
well, first of all, the outcome research, and there's been a lot since the 80s, really, on CBT, on various treatments, in particular CBT for social anxiety, show not only that CBT is the most effective treatment, but, and this is unusual because in a lot of other problems, like other anxiety disorders, it doesn't much matter in terms of outcome studies, to my understanding, whether the person is doing second wave CBT with behavioral experiments or purely exposure um, therapies in which there's no explicit discussion of thinking and so forth, that they either way they end up making similar progress. And also usually medication, depending on the disorder, tends to help just as much. Social anxiety is different.
Yeah,
With social anxiety, doing behavioral experiment, doing purely exposures in which you do not, in the very traditional way, in which you don't address explicitly thinking that makes somebody anxious, much less feel shame, is still moderately effective, but not as effective as doing behavioral experiments. And both of them are more effective than medication, which is amazing, although medication can still really help, but
yeah,
they are more effective. So there's that. Um, the other thing is, it's always turned me off, and I don't know if honestly this is just because I'm Jewish, and I always disliked this idea of we have the right religion, you're wrong, you're going to go to hell if you don't adopt our religion. And I start reading many years ago all this third wave literature, and it felt like that. Even though I love the content,
yeah.
so it's not the content that bothered me. I adopted the content readily, the mindfulness, the thought diffusion, all of the values, focus work. How could you not like that?
Right.
But the idea that somehow if you dally into dealing with thoughts directly, that takes people away. It's not working. And that just wasn't my experience in working with clients. And so in my groups from early on, I would introduce both cognitive restructuring, very second wave, exposure work, very first wave,
Hmm.
and mindfulness, but not meditation, because outcome studies show that meditation isn't any more helpful for social anxiety than placebo, but
Hmm.
external mindfulness, where you're focusing on the conversation, the
Right.
activity, the person in the moment. And I'd introduce all those things and then give people detailed questionnaires at the very last session about what were the things you found most helpful. And there's a little bit of variation, but on average, they all said all of them were helpful. And it
Yeah.
seemed to me that it didn't make sense to try to adopt a purist approach. And then at some point early on, I learned David Clark's strategy where he doesn't use the word mindfulness because most people, when they think of that word, they think meditation. But
Meditation. Yeah.
he calls it attention training. So it's still external mindfulness. He does that from the very first or second session. And it seemed to me that's so important because one of the most important safety behaviors that trip up people who are socially anxious and universally, perhaps next to avoidance, is focusing internally
Yeah.
on what do I say next, critiquing what they said last, trying to desperately imagine what is this person thinking of me, but they're really just thinking about themselves at that point. And all that self-thinking gets in their way of having a decent conversation or doing whatever else they're doing. So from early on, learning to train somebody to be, I call it curiosity training, to get out of your head and focus externally with curiosity, with interest on the person, the conversation, rather than on judging yourself, is so crucial, combined with doing exposures as behavioral experiments to test both the underlying shame-based beliefs as well as the surface level anxious predictions.
Right. Yeah, and I think it is so important to have that clinical flexibility, right? People that are very mired in one particular approach, I think they really miss that richness of being able to offer all of these different options and perspectives to the client to address what really is. I mean, this is a whole person that we're trying to treat here, that
That's right.
they're comprised of so many different life experiences, and so managing them from all of these different angles, I think, is just terrific. But yeah, I love your book. We're going to link. We're going to be able to link a link for your purchasing your book in our discussion section, and so I really encourage people to purchase it. So your article ends on such a hopeful note about replacing shame with pride and self-confidence. Where does self-compassion fit into that process? And how is it different from just positive thinking?
Well, it's certainly distinctly different than positive thinking. And I make this point with pretty much all my clients, including depressed clients and people with other problems, whenever I introduce cognitive restructuring, that it's not about the power of positive thinking. It's about learning to think in a way that's more realistic and helpful and self-compassionate, especially for a socially anxious person. That last piece is really important. Learning to accept that, yeah, sometimes you will blunder. Sometimes you will say a so-called stupid thing or make a mistake that's sort of obvious, or do something that is a little bit embarrassing and would be for anybody if they did it. I mean, that some of these things happen. Their fear isn't irrational, it's exaggerated. And so the self-compassion piece is learning to accept that that's a normal part of being human. And often it's learning to sort of laugh at it, not in a demeaning way, but like, there's something kind of funny about getting the person's name wrong or asking their name the second time, even though they already told me. And also learning, using Christine Podesky's assertive defense of the self technique of learning to be able to say, oops, silly me, sometimes I just forget things. How
Yeah.
about you? Do you ever forget things? And it turns it into a normal conversation. So learning to accept our deficiencies as opposed to feeling shame about our deficiencies is key. But it's not about pretending that we don't have deficiencies, because we do,
Yeah.
although they're not as great as a socially anxious person typically believes. So there's that as well. The other thing is that I do have a particular technique that I like that I introduce with almost everyone. I don't want to say it helps everyone, but it helps most of my clients. And it's an expansion of the sort of famous gratitude journal, but I call it a pride and gratitude log. I use the word log, so people that don't like to write aren't intimidated, but nonetheless, it's also about pride and gratitude, so that after every behavioral experiment, and then ultimately after every day, even if they're not doing an explicit experiment that day, they're writing down the positive things they did. That's the gratitude piece, the positive things they experienced. But then the pride piece is then writing down, what does that say about you?
Yeah.
If they had even if it's as simple as I had a 4-minute conversation that went pretty well with a coworker I normally avoid talking to. So that's certainly a point of gratitude. But then I asked, what does that say about you? I said, well, maybe it's that people can enjoy chatting with me if I can, if I focus externally with curiosity. Well, then that's a pride piece as well that helps diminish shame. It's kind of like the old evidence log to challenge old core beliefs, but I'll use
Hmm.
it even before we explicitly do any core belief work. And just by asking, what does this say about you? So they're gathering positive evidence about themselves that it's challenging their underlying beliefs even before we explicitly target and
Right.
talk about the core beliefs.
Yeah. Wonderful. Just incredible insights there, Larry. So, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you co-founded the National Social Anxiety Center, which now includes more than 30 regional clinics around the country. And I'm proud to say that the practice I have in Long Beach, California, is one of those regional clinics. So, how does the National Social Anxiety Center's mission reflect this more holistic, integrative approach to treatment?
Well, so we're very rigorous about requiring, I mean, we are a membership organization, but you can't just join. It's a whole process. And
Oh, yes,
part
I
of that
know.
process, yeah, that's right. And part of that process is being certified. Initially, the certification was only accepted through the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, as it was called then, Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies now. And we, of course, added a couple others, the ABPP, and now the Beck Institute
Back
has all
Institute.
have similar certifications in CBT. So part of it is you have to be certified, but we're flexible as to, some people are heavily ACT oriented, which of course is very third wave, and some
Hmm.
people are very traditionally exposure therapy focused, and some people are more Beckian second wave. And we don't worry about that stuff. What we do is make sure that the person can provide a convincing case conceptualization of how to work with somebody with social anxiety. And we do that through an interview process or a written process. And some of them, do a very combined approach, which I really love. That's my personal bias. Some people are doing it in primarily emphasizing one of the ways or not, but if they can convince us that they understand what makes a socially anxious person suffer so much, why they're socially anxious, and how we can use some version of CBT to effectively help them, then that works for us. So it's a very integrative CBT approach that we encourage.
Right. Yeah. And you've been doing this work for decades, training clinicians, leading CBT groups, 100, I can't believe that, CBT groups, writing and now publishing your workbook. What has been the most rewarding about your career, the long focus that you've had on social anxiety disorder and then also shame?
Truthfully, the thing that is most personally rewarding is every now and then I'll get an email from a former client to just tell me how well they're doing,
Hmm.
which is often very uplifting. Actually,
Yes, it
it is
is.
almost always very uplifting and very gratifying.
Yeah.
Uh, and also just to, even while I'm still working with clients, to just see and be able to remind people, because, I'm seeing them maybe once a week, depending, and later on, usually every other week. Uh, so I'm seeing a whole series of snapshots and of course, they're living with themselves obviously all the time. They may not notice certain growth in themselves that is really obvious to me. And so I really like pointing out, remember when you said this, and now
That's
you're
right.
experiencing that, and seeing them recognize, oh my goodness, I really have made a lot of progress that maybe they didn't recognize on their own. That's also very gratifying. On a more macro level, what's gratifying to me is just, I remember when I co-founded NSAC, I mean, we started talking about it in 2013 with my colleague in San Francisco, John Montopoli. We didn't know of other people doing social anxiety work. Obviously, there was already a manual about it, but there wasn't a lot of talk about it. And then before we knew it, as we started this organization, it wasn't hard to find other clinics who wanted to specialize and focus on specializing or learn to specialize in this area. And indeed, it's depending on the survey, it's the third or fourth most common mental health disorder in the US anyway.
That's right.
And one thing that's gratifying for me is to see how much more attention, both among clinicians but also researchers, there is on social anxiety now than there was, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's true. There's, I think, a lot more information out there, and some of my colleagues are always sort of marveling. Those of us who do a lot of this work, we always sort of marvel at the number of clinicians who don't, right? But the
Uh,
information is really out there now, and so hopefully, everybody who's listening will consider picking this up as part of their practice.
or,
So
or, or
yeah,
clinicians who think they know how to do the work. This is one of my pet peeves.
yeah,
If a clinician doesn't have any training or at least decent reading about how to effectively work on social anxiety, a real common mistake, even for those clinicians that are willing to do behavioral work as opposed to purely psychodynamic, a real common mistake is to feed into their shame-based core beliefs that they're deficient and to say, okay, I'll teach you how to have a conversation with a stranger. Well, that's why
right,
they're socially anxious in the first place. It's not that they don't know how to have a conversation with a stranger, but they believe they don't know how. In other words, they have shame-based beliefs. And so
right,
if you're teaching social skills to somebody who actually already has those social skills, you're reinforcing their negative shame-based beliefs that they're socially inept and you're not helping
excellent
them. In
point.
some ways, you're hurting them. And that's such a common practice among people who haven't had training or at least reading about CBT for social anxiety.
Excellent point. Really great point. So we're sort of wrapping up our interview here, and I want to ask you, where do you see CBT heading in the next decade when it comes to addressing emotions like shame, pride, and self-acceptance? I think perhaps now more than ever in this country, this is a time when those themes are important to talk about.
Indeed. Well, you know, at the risk of sounding too woke, the thing that is most encouraging to me in the CBT field, not in the country, but in the CBT field, is how much more attention is being given to adapting CBT in a culturally sensitive way that acknowledges that not all our pain is in our head, but it's often in society as it affects us. And that's true for all sorts of minority groups. And for a lot of people, they internalize that as shame. And sometimes that becomes depression. Sometimes it becomes social anxiety. Oftentimes it becomes both. And so it's really encouraging to see, but it's fairly nascent, I think, but at least it's really growing to see more and more attention in the CBT world about how to adapt our work in ways that are culturally sensitive, but not only about sensitivity and all that, but also about in dealing with the reality that actually some of their emotional difficulties are triggered by things that actually exist and are not just distorted thinking.
That's
And
right.
so I'm very encouraged by the growth of that area in CBT.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And it's interesting, right? When we think back to, Christine Podesky's original five-part model, right? The importance of adding environment into that model, right? As something that is truly a factor. I think you're absolutely right, Larry. I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. Yeah. So I found this to be such a wonderful discussion with you. I really enjoyed this. And if anybody would like to read Larry's full article, Shame, the Often Neglected Target in CBT for Social Anxiety, you can find it on the ACBT blog. And if you're a diplomate or a fellow who's interested in contributing your own article, we'd love to feature you in a future blog author spotlight. It's a wonderful way to share your ideas, promote your work, and help highlight what high quality CBT looks like in practice. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on the ACBT Blog Author Spotlight series.
Thank you.
Thanks, Larry.